Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Hello.
My name is Melissa Giroux, and I am a co-founder I'm a co-founder of Embrace Race. I'm also a mother and a mixed race Black white woman, and this is
Andrew Grant Thomas, also a co-founder, married to this mixed race Black woman and
Black
identifying
and White.
as
Yeah.
Black and white woman,
Mhm.
mixed race Black and white woman, and identifying as Black or African American. We're really glad to see you here.
Yeah. And as I said, we're co-founders of Embrace Race, and Embrace Race is a community of support for parents, teachers, caregivers, grandparents, who are concerned about kids and who want to help raise kids who are informed, thoughtful, and brave around race. So that's what we do. We have this webinar series has been actually going on for a long time, and Allison was our first guest almost 4 years ago.
And maybe our second too.
Yeah, and that was, I think it was only audio then, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the webinar is sort of one of the places, one of the spaces we have, one of the tools. It's a regular thing. I hope you join us if you're new every time and join the conversation. We also have resources, action guides, articles, lots of things that can help you answer questions about your kids, what to say in certain situations, what to do, how to model, all of that good stuff. And it really does show, the resources show a great range of concerns of people who are positioned racially very differently. So you should check all that out. So tonight we are talking, the topic is I Still Can't Breathe, Supporting Kids of Color Amid Racialized Violence. And we're talking with Allison, who will be introduced, about the conversations about policing, violence, race, safety, justice we should be having with our kids now. A lot of them we should have been having before now, but in this context as well, which is pretty fraught for many reasons that you're all very familiar with. I'm going to pass it along to Andrew, who's going to introduce our guest.
Yeah, and this webinar is sort of a companion piece to the one we did on Tuesday, early this week, which used the Central Park case of Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper as a point of departure for talking about how we can raise white children to be, anti-racist. Now, so this one is focused on, again, as Melissa says, children of color, using really sort of George Floyd, policing, protests, and so on as a point of departure. We will, we got tons of questions, just giving you a heads up. We got tons of questions, amazing, wonderful questions, and we will be, sort of prioritizing those that focus on children of color. Allison Briscoe-Smith. So Melissa already said it. Allison has been a guest more frequently across our 40-odd webinars than anyone else, which gives you some idea of the love and respect, the esteem in which we hold our colleague. It's great to have you back, Allison. Let me give just a quick rundown of some of her credentials, but when she speaks, no pressure, you'll hear how fabulous she is. Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith is a clinical child psychologist who specializes in trauma and issues of race. She earned her undergrad degree from Harvard, her clinical psych PhD from University of California, Berkeley. She combines her love of teaching and advocacy by serving as a professor and directing mental health programs for children experiencing trauma, homelessness, or foster care. She's an adjunct professor at the Wright Institute. Much of her work is with the Bay Area schools and nonprofits. As a clinician, a consultant, a trainer. Welcome back, Allison. Great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And, those are, in the work you do, you're getting a lot of exposure there in the Bay Area to what's going on right now. We'd love to hear first about what are you seeing?
Yeah. Well, first I want to begin by thanking you all for providing this as a forum and an opportunity for me to speak in this way. And it's very much related to what I am seeing, which is that, I serve as a clinical psychologist, so I see and treat families and children. So that's one piece. But I've also been really called upon this week and honestly called upon in part because people had reached out and already seen your resources. So I'm interacting a lot with parents and parents who are holding a lot of concern about how their kids are faring And also, you know, in the midst of a pandemic, I've been getting a lot of opportunity to work with parents and think about how parents are managing lots of stress in general. So with that kind of view, I'm seeing a whole bunch of different things. I actually want to begin the conversation by seeing the things that I think we need to kind of keep our eyes on, which is I have the opportunity to be in service with some youth and some youth of color, and the radical advocacy that they are doing. You know, they're literally putting their lives on the line by marching in the context of a pandemic. They are organizing, they are using Zoom and social media to get out there. And I have been just moved and ultimately feel hopeful when I get to see youth activate in that way. So that's a place that I want us to kind of pay attention to and to look for the resilience and the radical nature of this generation in particular. This generation has had it rough. It's been a challenge for them, and their means of kind of mobilizing, I'm awestruck by. On the other kind of space, I want us to kind of think about the places where I'm seeing other kids, which is that they're struggling, right? And so, you know, places that we're worried, and that this is a combination of, as the title is framed, this is nothing new. It's this magnitude in the context of being separated from friends, being separated from family, being not having your milestones, you know, doing those kinds of things is an added stressor for many kids. So I want us to listen in to see how those kids are really doing. The last thing that I'm seeing, parents, we're kind of having it rough. Parents are both manifesting amazing resilience and strength in terms of how we're managing all the different layers that are coming at us in the midst of a pandemic. You know, now I can homeschool my kids, or now, you know, I've been making bread from scratch, whatever it is. Like we're doing those kinds of pieces, but this is extraordinarily challenging. As we as humans, we as people of color are suffering in this pandemic in particular ways. And when I say this pandemic, I also mean this racial pandemic. American Psychological Association identified this as a pandemic of racism. So I'm really worried about how we're doing as parents, and also really just grateful to have an opportunity to speak to parents and try to provide some level of support.
Yeah, and so what are you telling those parents? What are you telling those kids? Like when we talk about kids, when should we start to worry about them? What are the behaviors that are troubling?
And Allison, just to make sure I'm tracking, you named at least 3 groups, right? Parents in stress, worried about their kids, kids who are, it sounds like, if not thriving, then certainly activated and active. And then also some children who are in distress, have worries and so on. Yeah. Okay.
So, you know, to answer that question about, you know, when should we be worried? The real piece that I want us to kind of focus on, and what I'd like to kind of tell folks, is that 2 parts. Number 1, we have to put our own oxygen mask on first, we as parents. And I know that gets trite and it's said all the time, but I really honestly mean it. Like, we, in this particular moment, have to spend, and when I say that, spend 10 minutes a day by yourself checking in. Am I doing okay? What do I need to sustain me? If I'm not doing okay in this moment, what can I get? And so I'm not talking about, you know, month-long retreats of silence. I'm talking about, I need to check in with myself to see how I'm doing, so I can see how I can be available for my kids. So I really want to kind of, you know, encourage us to kind of do that part. And if we can do that, then we can do the next part, which is really hard, which is we really have to listen to our children. We really have to, and when I say listen, I mean, we have to listen to the behavior of our toddlers. We have to listen to the play of our 4, 5, 6-year-olds. We have to listen to what our adolescents are telling us. We really have to listen. And we're going to have to do an extra bit of work of separating out our worry from what they're telling us. Because, you know, we have all these people here because they're worried, right? And we have a justifiable reason for being worried. We're all parents of many of us are parents of kids of color. And so there's a reason why we're worried. And we've got to put down our worry enough to listen to how they're doing. And to listen, how are they making sense of this? So that part I think is really important, but our capacity to listen is directly related to our capacity in general. How are we feeling? How are we doing?
That is so true. I am not listening, Allison. I have not been listening.
Yeah.
Today's a day of not listening very much.
And it's hard. Like the other piece that I've been, preaching on more in the context of COVID has been that of grace. And that, to have levels of grace. Like, number one, we have to have grace with our children. They've never been through a pandemic before, so their behaviors should look a little nuts. It should look a little funky at time, right? That they're not used to spending this time with us. So we have to have the grace to understand that their behavior is going to, move. We have to have grace in some ways for our institutions or schools as they're trying to figure out how to make this transition. And that's a place that I hold tremendous frustration. And we know where inequity really is rife, is right there. But we also have some grace with ourselves as parents. Because again, if we're contextualizing this, right, this wave of racialized violence that is not new to anybody, and it's in the context of shelter in place. It's in the context of being physically concerned about our health in yet another kind of, in a global kind of way. So, this is a moment for us to have some grace with ourselves around our capacity to listen is already pretty narrowed. And then you add on our own racialized stress, it's narrowed even more. And that's also, I think, what's called upon when people are asking, what can they do to help? Will help us expand our bandwidth a bit for being able to kind of to listen.
Allison, you mentioned, so as you say, a lot of the, folks that we have that we're watching right now are worried, and they have a range of worries. And you already said some really great things about, right, to the extent that we can separate our worry from what our children's experience is, emotional and otherwise, that's actually a place. And the place to start, I love you talking about taking care of ourselves, right, as adults in the life of children. And you started to, you've already started to tease apart the various ways in which different children might be feeling anxious, worried, distressed. There are a number, right? It's a mix of things going on there, and we'll get into some more particulars. But do you have any more sort of general guidance for, the literally thousands of folks who are watching this right now about, you've sensed some distress in your child and you want to preserve or help, sort of restore some sense of joy, right, to your child who is indeed, there's a reason why that child may be under some stress. Any general advice about how to do that?
Yeah, I think the general rule of thumb that I've heard invoked by a number of psychologists that are doing this work right now is we should anticipate in this particular time, in the context of shelter in place and the distress, and also in the context of this extraordinary wave of racialized violence, we should anticipate that some of our children are going to have behavioral and psychological changes. The place for our concern is twofold. As much as I'm saying we got to think about our worry, I do want us to trust our guts. We know our children, right? And that voice in your heart, in your stomach that says, I don't think he's okay. I want us to be able to listen to that and not rationalize out of that. Mm-hmm. And what I look for as a psychologist, as I look for persistent change, I'm not looking for the 1 day or the 2 day of moodiness. I'm looking for persistence in the change, that it's going on a really long time and seems immovable. I also think about that notion of persistence because, I just got off the phone with a student who, can't get out of bed. And she's not supposed to. She's grieving. She's having a really, really, really hard time. So, I'm going to leave her alone for a bit. I'll be more worried if I call her next week and she's still not out of bed. It's the persistence. And that what we're really talking about is extraordinary highs and lows of behavioral dysregulation, of mood, of affect, of sleep. And that's also happening in the context, all our boundaries fell out the window in terms of they're not going to school anymore. You're not going to work anymore. Or if you are going to work, how you're maybe stepping into work with more fear than before. So, the typical boundaries of how kids are held have fallen apart. So why wouldn't we expect some sort of range and change with that? So those are the things I look for as a clinical psychologist. I'm not worried if a parent calls me and says, my 14-year-old's having a hard time sleeping. but I am more worried if having a hard time sleeping for the past 3-4 weeks, and nothing I can do can really, shift that.
And this, I just want to highlight just one thing that is that I think is lovely about what you're saying. It's very easy for us to think that, right, sadness, just being down, being worried, being concerned, being angry, that this is itself indicative of a problem. You're saying, no, actually, doesn't that make perfect sense? that kids would feel that way. And again, yes, only when it becomes, perhaps embedded and sort of calcified, and that is not an issue.
I sort of heard that as you giving me permission to sleep in tomorrow.
Oh, totally.
Yes.
Yeah.
We didn't need permission.
Well, the parallel is that we have to do that ourselves. We need to give our children access to our navigation of the full emotional range, right? Like, for me to be like chipper in the midst of a pandemic and racialized violence all day, every day isn't real. And it teaches them that they have to negotiate horrible trauma by getting rid of their own feelings. And I will say that we want to be thoughtful about, we want them to see our full range of our own humanity. And when we can't get out of bed for days, then we need some help. Right. And when I have no patience to listen anymore and I'm angry all the time, we need some help. So it's also about that kind of compassion in ourselves too. And again, so much of this is a conversation about what we tell our kids. It's what they're seeing. It's what they're seeing in us.
And then, Allison, you're seeing a range of parents and families. And you said it's harder to see kids during COVID, right? But I'm wondering about the differences you're seeing in how they're responding, just racial differences, if there are. And we certainly got a lot of questions about sort of people of color allies concerned, about anti-Blackness. And so I'm just wondering what the specific fears around one's racial identity are in these times.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to kind of locate this in a couple different ways. One of which I want to start with Black kids. And again, while owning the great variability, the message that Black kids are receiving is that their lives do not matter. And that, we are getting questions. I get this question from my son: will a police officer kill me? That question about what that means to have that located in their bodies and in their spaces is heartbreaking. It's too much. And so, of course, we're going to expect some worry, some anxiety to kind of come up with that we will mediate, and that this is all about like how it is that we're going to make some change with that, right? And then we can think about the other kind of ways. It's not unusual for other kids to ask that question. It's just that I can't as easily to my Black son say, "No, you'll be fine." So even in the context too, we can think about the broader kind of notion of racism. So, all the folks that are here with us that are folks of color have a language of, or can have a language of racism, how racism is showing up. So when they're seeing this going on, or when kids are seeing this, it can be framed within the family around, racism. Like, how do we understand racism? How does it show up? So that again is another place that kids might feel and embed in a proximate kind of way, about how they feel about that. Then we move out to another layer, another circle of our community, which is white folks, which is that the translation of what will happen or what may happen to kids might feel different for white folks. That the presumed necessity to talk about this might feel different, or perhaps the landmarks by which to talk about it. For many folks, I think it's a new conversation for white folks to have with the children, and they're struggling with how to talk about it. Whereas many other folks of color have had to have a conversation about race since jump as a means of protecting and engaging our kids. So I'm not sure that I actually got to your question, but I'm thinking about it in these different kinds of realms. And what I'm seeing is, it's not to say that I don't have, Latinx kids who are really anxious, and they're impacted by racism, and I was talking with a client today whose family has DACA. So wanting so desperately to go and protest, but feeling not only is their life on the line, but they're, that they could be sent back to, their home country. So that's a stressful piece to embody. And that's actually a shared, or can be a place of shared experience of the terror and the horror of what's going on.
One of the things that, Melissa's question highlights for me, and your answer as well, right, is that, of course, there are different degrees of vulnerability, right? We're not all situated the same with respect to what's going on, whether that's COVID or the protests or police brutality, certainly. And our children aren't either. So we, especially with the young children, our inclination as parents, as adults who love them, is how do we protect them? And so one thing I hear in what you're saying is, well, be honest, right? Sometimes there are assurances we cannot give depending on their vulnerability. And then where we can give those assurances because of our particular circumstances, they may well have friends, peers who are vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if you can say a little something about, how do we walk that line between, yes, maybe some of us can give assurances, with respect to some things, but we also want our children to be aware that not everyone is so privileged in that way. So can you say a little something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think even the language that you just talked about is like the way that you actually just phrased it is a language that kids can grasp. What you just provided in the question was 60 seconds of, something that could be translated. This is really, impactful for us because we're Black folks. And we also know that there are other people that are impacted by terrible things that are going on as well, and invoke friend's name and invokes it. And what we want to be able to do is care for ourselves and care for others. Or if I could flip that, we know that we're actually in a place that we're really lucky, that because we're white, people won't look at us in the same kind of way. And we don't feel like that's right. And we want to think about all our Black brothers and sisters in community and how we want to be a support. So, I mean, I think the language, more than anything, I think it's not that the language isn't available to us. It's that we get caught up in the fear of saying the right thing. That you want to have the right thing. And I'm hearing that from so many folks within my white community, that the worry is that if I say the wrong thing, then I'll hurt somebody, and I don't want to hurt anybody. And my encouragement is that this is not about being the perfect parent. It's about being the good enough parent that can make a mistake and narrate that mistake, to be accountable and kind of come back. The last piece that I really want to think about in terms of another piece that I'm seeing a lot in the context of folks of color and white folks and outside of Black folks is the prevalence of guilt. So I feel guilty that I'm not impacted in the same way. I feel guilty that I'm not out protesting. I feel guilty that I'm housed. Is this idea of guilt. And so I think I know people are getting caught up in understanding and appreciating their privilege, and getting overwhelmed by senses of guilt. And I also want to articulate that that's the cost of racism. The cost of racism is that any one of our spaces of intention of helping folks out gets labeled and smashed down as being about being guilty. So I want to encourage us not to persist in the guilt, but persist in our places of relationship and care, and to try to do that. And I think that's the same thing that we're seeing with our kids, is the worry that we have in the conversation around to our kids around a privilege is that maybe they'll feel guilty. So I think we get a chance to kind of talk to them about that our privilege doesn't make us bad people. It means that we have a space to move into action.
That's really helpful, Allison. It's a
really
beautiful response. And, this talk about, again, this appreciation for the different ways in which different people might be situated with respect to the various sort of threats against some of our communities. And opportunities, for that matter, in some of this, gets to, and now we're moving into questions. We got, as Melissa said at the front, so many great questions, a lot of great questions coming in. Of course, we won't get to nearly all of them, but we're trying to pull some clusters of questions, right, that point to a lot of the sort of shared concerns or just whatever it is people may want to say. One I want to speak to, and we've got a lot of questions on this, are right parents, teachers, etc., whose loved ones include mixed race kids, right? Multiracial kids who literally are asking, or very close to it, where do I fit in all this, right? I'm not Black, I'm not white, maybe I'm neither, or maybe I'm both. How do you speak to the child who wants to know, have I disappeared in this narrative around what's happening?
I mean, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about this. I'm in the middle of completing a book exactly on this, and where we landed within this, and we revised it a couple different times, but it's going to go back. You're going to hear this message, is the radical listening that is necessary, and the radical listening that's necessary is not especially in the context of being a mixed kid now. So we brought in kids and their parents and had them talk to each other. And then we also brought in siblings and had them talk to each other and really listen to what they were saying. And we didn't get questions from them about, I don't know where I belong. It's that other people won't let me belong. That's very different.
Right.
That's very, and, I can't speak to that to my own experience because I'm not mixed, but maybe Melissa, you can. But, that the idea isn't that a person understands who they are. It's that so many people are unwilling to listen.
Right.
And this is what the research bears out. This is what these kids told us, is that mixed kids have agency in their identification and fluidity. And, all of the kids that we interviewed who were part Black knew and wanted to claim their Blackness. And that was taken from them by adults who refused to see them that way, or adults who wanted to categorize them. So, I have one simple part. What does your child want? And in this kind of context, we have to understand why it's so compelling to try to move into whiteness. And I see that in terms of what parents are trying to do sometimes with their mixed kids is we've sublimated and transcended race. Race doesn't matter in our family, and we can see that. Kids are telling us that it doesn't really feel that way. What's going on in the streets doesn't really feel that way. And then it's also really understandable. I'll give a quick kind of example. So years and years ago now, we took our kids to a Black Lives Matter rally. And my son must have been maybe like 5 or 6 at the time. And so we were walking, and he was asking, so why are we doing this again? I'm like, well, we're doing this because people haven't been kind to Black folks. And he turns to me and he goes, well, I'm Black. And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, but it's okay because I'm white too. Mm-hmm. And so, and he's a mixed Black, white, Mexican kid. And it makes sense that the kids in this moment of fear might be compelled to move into a place. That was a very 6-year-old way of thinking about it, right? Mm-hmm. About like, well, you're telling me people aren't kind to people like me, so maybe it's better to be like them, right? So we got to be able to kind of listen to that and not judge them for it, but listen to it. I think I went off on that point, but let me come on back.
It's all good.
No, it really makes sense. I mean, one of the things because of I'm, white presenting, but it's always up to the thing that's so interesting about mixed race people is it's up to the person who's identifying you. I mean, how they're gonna, you can't predict it. I mean, you can't predict how they're gonna identify you and what that's gonna mean, and it depends on the context and who you're with. But what we always do, or what I always do, is talk about how we self-identify and how others identify us, and they're not always the same thing, and so for some people they are the same. Andrew felt a little silly saying, I'm Andrew and I'm African, he's like, don't know that, but it really kind of underlines that it's constructed, right? And that actually, what does that mean? Like the divisions are not that clear. So yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. So we had, a bit related to that, we did have a question about a 6-year-old who calls herself Brown, who is Korean American and white American. And she has been freaking out because she wishes she were, especially in light of Black Lives, the movement for Black Lives and all that's happening, she wishes she were either Black or white, anything but brown. And her mother says she's struggling mightily with where she belongs and where to identify, which I suspect may be the case for many brown children right now, especially from mixed non-traditional homes, not pinned to one ethnicity. So you were talking about that truth, but I wonder what you say to a parent to help a child who's really struggling with it right now.
Mm-hmm. I think one of which is to listen and to validate that struggle. Sweetheart, I understand why it's so hard to feel like you've got to pick a side, because it looks like what's happening outside means that people have to pick, and then you've got a reference to your own self, right? And that it can be complicated if your racialization is different than your child, but you can also say, especially if you have similar experiences, I remember what that's like too. I remember that people wanted to kind of make me pick a side. And what I've decided to do is not pick, and this is who I am. So it would be kind of listening to the child and kind of coming back to our own. And this is a big thing that I've spoken about with you all in different ways, is that we do have to make a way out of no way. We do have to give our stories, right? And are stories of resilience as much as they're stories of struggle too. And to know that this is going to happen. I think what I hear in that is a worry and a concern about how the child is freaking out, but I also hear like an anticipatory worry that maybe they won't like themselves. So again, that's our worry, and we've got to slow down with that. We know that we have to expect that children, brown children, black children, children of color raised in this society are going to struggle a bit with their identity because of the messages that are out there.
Yeah.
And that, I hate to say that, there's grief in that, right? Like none of us want that to have to happen. And it's a place that we can kind of think about and support.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question from Autumn, who says, if our Black children are not exposed to news and media right now, is it okay to let them stay unaware of the tumult? Or does it do them a disservice, especially my 10-year-old, but also my 13-year-old with limited screen access? I don't want to steal their confidence and joy. And, Allison, I know your kids are 3, 9, 11. So
Mm-hmm.
that question about the age,
Yep.
Does your answer depend on the age of the child?
So the answer depends a little bit on the age of the child, but my go-to question when I'm asked about this is, would you rather be the person who tells them about what's going on, or would you rather have them learn from someone else? Mm-hmm. Because they're gonna hear about it, and even if there's limited screen time, it's not far. It's not hard to find out, to hear a thing. And so it's okay to kind of titrate. And I think that's what a difference that I used to have before is this idea about we can speak to it, we can show them. And I think we're actually now I'm in a moment of like, if we can do some titration and if we can kind of limit, but if there's a kid that has a phone in their hand, I want to frame that as that's an access to images of viral Black death is what they have in their hand. It's only a second away. All the filters in the world, you're still going to get some part of that. And if not, then, my kid who's got access to that and your kid who doesn't, our kids are going to talk. And my kid will say. So I think we have to do that. But to answer pretty specifically, I think it's okay for us to do some titration and talk about it. And we don't have to go in, this is a big thing, you don't have to go into all the details. I mean, you could hear in the language that I said for my son, people haven't been kind. I mean, that's an understatement, right? In terms of what it is, but that was a 6-year-old appropriate language for that. And now we have a discussion about not only were people not kind, but people are killing each other. And that Black people are getting killed in a particular way. So we can have more of that kind of conversation now. My 3-year-old, this is not the conversation that I'm having with her, and she can tell we're all distressed. So mama's having big feelings right now, or she knows, she's at the door right now. You in a meeting? Like she knows that we're, so we have to be able to have some kind of language around that kind of stuff. But the big question I come back down to is, who do you want to tell your child about what's going on? Mm-hmm. Not whether, but who.
But let's stay with that for a moment. You mentioned your 3-year-old. I think she's almost 3, so she's not even 3. So of course it's a different conversation. But we have another big cluster of questions around preschoolers. Mm-hmm. 2, 3, 4 years old, even 5 or 6.
Yeah.
What is it? Yeah. What does sort of responsible exposure look like at that age?
Yeah. I mean, I think about it this way. What an amazing opportunity and great age to start building in some of the skills to manage this. The skills of understanding skin color and pride and reading stories about, I'll speak about Black people just living, but also Black people thriving. What a beautiful age to begin an inoculation. Or an attempt. I don't think that my job as a parent is to protect. I think my job as a parent is to prepare. Mm-hmm. And that's me. That's not true for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. But I feel like my job is to get them ready. So I think 2, 3, I just did a wonderful talk with a community of pregnant and expecting folks to help them get ready to think about how they're going to talk about race. And I was blown away by people's eagerness to kind of think about it. So in the context of this particular racialized violence, you're already teaching your children about we don't hit. You're having that conversation with a 2-year-old. Mm-hmm. Why? Right? And so that's the larger kind of context. We are kind to each other. We do not use our hands and our bodies to harm each other. you're having that as a conversation right now. And that is the conversation that's being held in the streets at another level.
Yeah. Wonderful.
So we have a question from Romina. She says, I'm wondering if there are specific ideas or tools that can be discussed on how to help kids of color release tension, fear, and anger from their bodies.
Mm-hmm. I think that's actually one of the things that's particularly challenging in the context of COVID, is that the ways that I would typically support folks is to be in community and like, so sports or dance, you know, because it was about our physical kind of movement, but it was also about being in community. But I'm also really impressed with, you know, there's a Zoom class, you know, for dancing. My son's basketball team is meeting via Zoom tomorrow. So I don't think they're going to be doing any drills or anything, but still, like, so I do think that one of the things, the caveats in this particular time is that we really have to be conscientious about providing that. So there are, you know, anything developmental range. I think what you want to pay attention to is, number one, your own body. Where are you in your own bodies, and what are you doing with your own bodies? Are you going out for a run? Are you going out for a walk? Are you doing, you know, sit-ups in the room? My son has started doing these 7-minute workouts, you know, so it's something like that. But I think the idea of paying attention to our bodies is of central and foundational importance. And so we can encourage our kids to, and this can be hard. The thing that I've heard a lot from parents is how hard it is to get their teenagers out of the house right now to go for a walk. And the piece that I want to kind of say around that is it's okay for us to have, as parents, to have something that is non-negotiable. That I know that there's a lot of things that are going on with our parenting right now that we want to be extra flexible and extra kind, and understanding the grace. So I want to invoke grace, but it's okay to pick a place to fight. And that fight might be, you've got to be in movement for 15 minutes. That fight might be, you have to come on this walk with me. That fight might be,
we have those fights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've decided we're going to fight about walks.
And you know what, I have to say, a good 30% of the people I talk to are having fights about. You know, I finally worked with one family where they just were like, look, if you do this amount of walking, then you can get this reward, which, you know, is a behavioral way of kind of doing it, but it's really worked. Right. So, and that idea of walking and being outside, and I know that outside is not available and not safe to everybody, but the idea about kind of doing something within your bodies, I think is super important. Mm-hmm. A dance class, a movement, something that attunes us to that. The last part, in terms of joy, we've got to listen to what brings our children joy. Right. And so how do we kind of cue into that? So music, songwriting, art, whatever it is, to give some kids an opportunity to kind of do that.
Mm-hmm. We have a lot of questions from educators and about educators, right? Mm-hmm. So from, you know, parents thinking about the return to school at some point. You know, we across many of our programs, our webinars, we have this sort of variant on this question of, you know, I'm concerned that my son's teacher, my daughter's teacher may not understand, right, that when she, typically, most often she talks about X, that might actually be traumatizing for my son. Or even if it's not traumatizing, not appreciating that, you know, the range of kids in the classroom, again, are differently situated with respect to that issue. And they're not necessarily all sharing what they're feeling at the end of, you know, coming off what we're coming off. Right. So we have a bunch of questions from parents around, yeah, how do I, and of course we know kids and parents, families, schools are going back to a range of circumstances almost surely. And, you know, all the complexity we know. So the basic question, I think, is, yeah, how, as a parent, do you engage a teacher, right, so that the teacher understands that your child and other children may have somewhat different needs, and that what the teacher has to say may land differently on different ears? Yeah.
I mean, I think what you're talking about is so important in such a place like I felt tired hearing it. You know, there's a place of like, this is the, I mean, and I want everybody to hear, like, this is the added burden of being a person of color, is that we have to prepare for engaging with teachers to make sure that they're educating our children fairly. And thank goodness we've got brilliant, amazing teachers that are ready and willing and doing all of this, and it's hard. And I think the parallel is, if you, and there's intersections of it, but if you're a parent that has to get ready to talk to your teachers about your child who has special needs, that it takes more to do that, and that we have to do that within community. It's always more helpful when we have not just you asking that, but when your community of parents are asking for that. So I think it's a place of like, not just me, but how am I in a community that will lift up this question as well, that will lift up questions of equity, that will lift up questions of how will we treat folks. The other kind of piece too is that there are abundant resources for teachers. There are abundant resources for schools to learn more, to do more. I also know that there are such overwhelming pressures on our teachers that it doesn't mean that they're actually allowed to make use of those resources. But I think we have to be thoughtful about the communities that we pick, the school communities that we pick, and that's complicated, in all these kinds of different ways. But I guess my answer to that is it's not so much an answer, but a call upon the rest of our communities. That's a great place where we could be in community with each other and get some support. It'd make a big difference in my life if I didn't have to roll up to the one teacher and say, hey. It'd be much better if, and I'm really thankful that I'm actually in a community that does that, where the community will say, hey, we are noticing, and this is what we would really like to have for our kids. The last thing that I'll say about that is it's so compelling for us to go back to normal. Mm-hmm. And that the idea that going back to normal means that we won't have to talk about this. Yeah. And we won't have to do, and I think the push for all of us, as educators and other pieces, and this is not normal. This hasn't been normal for a bit, and let's not rush to return to normalcy when we've had so many children and families be disproportionately impacted from the pandemic and from this wave of racialized violence.
Mm-hmm. So a question here. I'm the white gay dad of 2 Black and brown sons, 5 and 8. I'd like to hear about ensuring I don't sugarcoat the information, but also don't instill extreme fear in them. So that's a different position, right?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it's really wise for all of us to be having that kind of, thinking and to kind of think about that. So you can tell where I'm going to go with this. So you should go ahead and try it. Try to say something to your kid. They'll tell you if it's too much.
They will.
Right? They'll tell you if it's too much. They'll tell you if it scares them. And then we provide them with the means of addressing the kind of fear is to provide them some place that's secure. Mm-hmm. So we should move to that. So the problem is when we give the fire and brimstone speech and then walk off, right? Or not follow up.
Right.
So we've got to be able to have the conversation and listen. But more of my worry is that so many folks are so worried that the conversation will be traumatizing that they don't have the conversation at all. Right. And I really want to challenge the notion that my conversation will be traumatizing. What's more traumatizing is not being equipped to face this and not being prepared. And that preparation takes time. We have to kind of think about this, is that this is not a talk. Mm-hmm. This is not a one talk, because I'm not going to sit you down and explain racism to you right now. That this is a small talk that you have all the time. Perhaps this is a forum where we get to talk about it more in the context of what's going on.
Yeah.
And, I really kind of encourage that father in particular to keep on having these small discussions. And when the children tell you that they are overwhelmed by it, provide them with the love and the support and the means of actually being okay in that moment.
Yeah, and there's also, like you were saying earlier, there's so much positive that's happening in this moment, that kids are doing, that people are doing. I just pulled up on my phone. I just took a walk, down the street, very close by, and this white family who we know had put these signs in their front yard that they made. And they said, the first one was, because of my white privilege, I can do the following without even thinking twice. And then it said things like, I can go jogging, Ahmaud Arbery, I can use my cell phone, Stefan Clark. I can sell CDs, Alton Sterling. I can go birding, Christian Cooper. And it just it just was so moving for me to just see, because so often you talk to your neighbor, you don't necessarily have that conversation, but you think, oh, their life is different. their kids' lives are going to be different. And they're kind of saying, look, our lives are different because we have this thing. And just to have it, to have them standing up, the way the kids that you talked about were demonstrating radical activism. There's a lot of hope in this time as well that we can use to tell the story, I think.
I mean, I think what we can kind of do is we can think about where are we cultivating our attention. And that's not to say that we should ignore. It's kind of impossible to ignore it. But it's not to say that we should ignore the bad. But we do need to figure out, wherever we put our attention, that will grow. And I think that's a chance that we get to have with our kids about like, yes, we can bear witness and be in this place of bearing this terribleness. And I'm going to invoke Mr. Rogers. We can look for the helpers, right? And that's I think the reason why that quote is so widely cited is how child specific and child friendly it is, which is to encourage us in the midst of terrible things to look for the helpers. And then I think the added kind of question is, I look for the helpers. How are you a helper? That's a conversation that can be had 3, 4, 5, 6. How are you a helper? It's a conversation that I still have with my older kids too, about like, well, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to help?
So Allison, this is, it's not a question, but it's so powerful and speaks to, we've talked a lot about what adults may be going through, especially adults of color. And, it's tempting to think of it largely, given the context in which we're having this conversation and what we're about, in the context of taking care of yourself, at least in part, so you can better care for the children that you love. I want to read this from Barbara. Being one of the first female African Americans to integrate schools in Richmond, Virginia, more than 50 years ago, I felt much pain yesterday as I watched the homegoing service of George Floyd. As an 8th grader, I experienced name calling, go home N-word, and my coat being dragged on the dirty floor and no one to come to my rescue, teacher, principal, nor National Guard. The knee was on my neck, so I couldn't breathe, but I survived, with the scars reappearing with the scene of George Floyd.
Yeah.
Anything, I mean, that's deep.
Yeah.
Right? Deep. I mean, the wounds go deep and from long ago and re-traumatized over time.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything you want to offer.
Yeah, the thoughts that I have about that actually come from someone that we both know and someone that you've worked with a lot, which is John Powell. And one of the things that he said, I'm going to misquote it, is that we tend to think about, scientists tend to think about that we are made up of atoms, but really we are made up of stories, and that the idea is that our means of kind of connection and survival and all of that. And that's also why we got to listen to our kids. We need to listen to their stories. I think, that beautiful offering that you just read in that person's experience is the most powerful story, and a story that can be read and told to our children. And then we ask, what do you think about that? What is that like? How do we understand that? Because that's a story, because, I also heard her say, and, all of those things happen and I'm here. And I'm not here and I'm scarred. I'm here and I'm wounded. I think that's also the piece of that we have to, and I hope that's also what's happening in the streets as well, that people are listening to other people's stories, and that the defensiveness that has been up for so long around needing to be the good person is actually falling down, so that we can listen to these stories and listen to the stories about what's kind of going on for folks. I think the stories are pushed upon us in the form of a viral video. But that is not the full story. I mean, I think we were also compelled by hearing George Floyd's daughter say, my daddy changed the world, so that's going to be a powerful, we have the opportunity to construct some stories here that are about having this be different.
And, Allison, I just have to say, I mean, the potentially therapeutic and prescriptive value of, as you say, of radical listening, I think we need to do so much more of that, including across generations. I mean, the elders in our community, and others to be sure, but certainly the elders in our community have such stories to tell. I think probably we can ask and hear and listen.
It's a great time to call them and ask. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a question from a therapist who's young Black client told her she watched a video on YouTube of an innocent Black person being murdered in their home while they were sleeping. My immediate response was to tell her not to watch those type of videos because I wanted to protect her from it. And I now think that wasn't the correct response. I want to return to the conversation and apologize to her for letting my instincts shut down a possible conversation and not allowing her to explore this more with me. I'm wondering how to process these incidents with children so young. I am a 24-year-old Latina mental health service provider working with children in the 2 to 8 year old range.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's twofold there, right? Especially with the young kind of kids, we do want to think about, is there a way of limiting their access, right? And that's actually hard for me to say because I'm actually a person that really believes that we should, read racist books to our kids so that they can learn how to read them, that we shouldn't, shy away from difficult kind of conversations. And this is a place that I feel like I've changed over the past couple of years. And I've changed it in part because my students have done some research. I have a student, Devonna Jacobs, that did research with Black adolescents, girls, and found that they were exposed to repeated images of Black viral death and viral Black death, like all the time on their phone. And not surprising, it's deleterious to their health. Seeing that, and that's the thing that is different now than in the 60s. It was bad in the proximity to that, but be able to see that in your hand. So I trust and really believe, the therapist instincts in that part were around, I don't want you to have to see that, which is different than you should stop looking at it. Those are two different things. I don't want you to see that. What can we do to actually help make sure that your view is not clouded by that? Mm-hmm. But of course, you're going to, turning away from it is really hard. Any of you have a hard time turning away from watching these videos? Yeah. It's a dopaminergic hit of fear that gets us quantitatively addicted. So how this therapist can return, they already did it. And it's a good example for all of us. I'm sorry, I think I made a mistake. I want for us to think a little bit more about this. I held some worry for you that you were seeing such terrible things. But I want us to think about when that comes up again in your hand, what we can do.
Mm-hmm. And it's so great to demonstrate that you can be wrong and that it's an ongoing conversation. I like your mug. It's an ongoing conversation, even as an adult, right? Yeah. That we make mistakes, we're fallible.
And just, and that came out of the question, but you, in your answer, I think for this, at least the second time in this conversation, you said, essentially, when I learned more, I did better, right? Think of that Maya Angelou quote, when I knew more, I did better. And, without recrimination, without self-loathing, without beating ourselves up, that's what we're going for, right?
Yeah. And don't we want to teach our kids that?
Exactly. Well, that's part of the modeling. Mm-hmm. We are coming close to the end. We have at least one more question. I want to pause here for a moment to offer just a few things, right? So, especially because we have so many folks who we know are new to this Embrace community. So just a few words especially to you, but to all of us. One, do the work. I think that's one of the, big takeaways from this. Melissa mentioned, I think Allison mentioned, that we have a lot of resources on Embrace Race. Allison is dropping pearls. We have a lot of stuff on the site. There's certainly other people. Read it. Right?
Yeah, you can read a lot of conversations we've had with Allison as well. Yeah,
as well, absolutely. There's a lot there. Keep going back to it. Keep working it. Number two, relatedly, stay with us, right? Again, a lot of you are new. This is not the work of one webinar, one day. Clearly not. It's another cliche, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. Stay with it. Stay with us. We certainly don't, we're learning a lot over these last 4 years. Mm-hmm. We're not experts. We're fellow travelers. Let's walk it together. Keep coming back. Mm-hmm. And third, if you find this webinar helpful and the rest of the work we do helpful, please help support it. We try to keep everything, and literally everything we offer now is free to the folks who use it, but it's certainly not free to produce. So if you have the means, please do support it if you're able to. And that leads us to perhaps our last question.
Mm-hmm. So Allison, maybe you want to go out maybe there's something you want to say in closing rather than my asking a last question, but I can ask a last question that's about maybe what you'll say will, I think this could lead to an ender here, but Kara asks, how can we keep young help young children feel proud and empowered, but also keep them safe from protests that may turn violent. So I'm wondering that whole, like, we want them to feel empowered, but we worry about them, sort of going back to what you said at the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, I think about it in this way is like, we have to, each of you as a family have to decide whether or not protesting is your way of making a change. It is a way. It's an important way. It's amazing for what's done. And there are other ways as well. And in terms of whether or not to make, the decision about bringing your children, we also have to think about there's risk in any of the things that we do. So you have to be prepared that should things go wrong, how are you going to protect your kids? Should things, I think explicitly in terms of, violence, I think you have to do the work to try to be as safe as possible. That's the same thing that we're doing. I mean, think about it. How many of y'all are bleaching your houses all the time, or washing your hands too much, or not enough, or putting on the mask? We've got these concrete kind of pieces of trying to do what we can to protect them from this invisible threat. It's the same kind of thing. So if you're going to choose to kind of protest, what are the things? Who can you go with? How do you go early? Have your car nearby. Like, it's the preparation. Again, It's not about not having something bad happen. It's about getting prepared. And I think that's the analogy here. And as you're kind of saying and invoking, this conversation is really different for me now from 10 years ago, because 10 years ago I had this kind of conversation. And when people asked me where the resources were, I'd have to point to just, one or two little things. Now I can say, go here and read all the things, watch all the webinars, look at there's no excuses anymore. Because so many folks, like yourselves, have consolidated information, have been doing hard work. So we can do this work. It's really, really possible. And I just want to end on the other piece that was really said again by John Powell, is that this is an inflection point. This is a moment that can be moved to make sure that things are different. And I know the places that we're weary is that we've had inflection points in the past, and we've had inflection points in the recent past. And as much as I kind of say that things are different now because they're worse in many different ways, they're also different now because the opportunity to really affect change is different. And our youth are stepping into it and leading it with such boldness and such fierceness that it's awe-inspiring. And that had to come from them and had to come from their parents as well. So I think we've got this, we can do this. And when I say do this, I think we can affect change so that, that hopefully in 2 years from now, I won't have to come back and have this conversation. Like, I hope never to toss y'all again. No, I'm kidding. I hope
Tell the truth, Allison.
I hope that we have, a bandwidth to engage in something different then. So I remain really hopeful to see, 2,000, people, or how many ever people kind of tuning in. And I really do hope that people continue to be invested. And for those of our community that are so weary, that we will help to lift them up with it.
Yeah, Allison, I just want to endorse that. And I want to encourage folks to take that possibility seriously, right? So it's not necessarily about being optimistic, meaning, you think it will work out super well, but there really is a reason for hope.
Yeah.
I just want to,
in part because things are so bad, right? It's like all of these, what? Like, he's president and COVID and
consider this. Consider this. I mean, it's a small thing, right? But it's not a small thing. We did 2 webinars this week. We've had 15,000 people register for 2 webinars for our small organization. I mean, and those 15,000 represent a lot more behind them. So of all races, et cetera. So keep hope alive, as Jesse used to say.
Yes.
Allison, thank you so much for another excellent, just a lot of pearls there.
Yeah, thank you,
And
Allison.
thank you, folks, for registering, for coming, and come back. Let's keep walking this together.
Yeah, have the regular conversation with us and with various folks that come through. And Allison, you'll come back. It might be a better time, but
we'll be talking about joy and how
we'll be happy to have a different conversation, but we want to keep talking to you for sure.
We'll have a sing along or something.
Yeah.
So
thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.